The Great Vernsby, Chapter 4. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Vernsby's house, and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "One time he killed a man who had found out that he was a nephew to von Hindenburg, and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that crystal glass." Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Vernsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed, "This schedule in effect July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the grey names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Vernsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. From East Egg, then, came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near, and the Ismays and the Cressiers, or rather Hubert Auerbach and Miss Cressier's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter after good no reason at all. Clarence Endive was from East Egg, as I remember. He came only once in white knickerbockers and had a fight with a bum named Etty in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles and the ORP Schraders, and Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia, and the Fishguards and the Ripley Snell. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel that night that Mrs. Ulysses' sweet automobiles ran right over his hand. The dancers came too, and S.B. Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Maurice Flink, and the Hammerheads, and Beluga, the tobacco importer, and Beluga's girls. From West Egg came the Poles and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck, and Cecil Schoen, and Gulick, the state senator, and Newland Orchard, who controlled films par excellence, and Eckhouse and Clyde Clowen, and Don C. Schwartzy, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all connected with the movies in one way or another, and the Catlips and the Bimbergs, and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. De Fontano, the promoter, came there, and Ed Legros and James B. Rotgut Ferret, and the De Jongs and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden it meant he was cleaned out, and Associated Traction would have to fluctuate profitability next day. A man named Klipspringer was there so often and so long that he became known as the Boarder. I doubt if he had any other home. Of theatrical people there were Miss Gust Ways, and Horace O'Donovan, and Lester Meyer, and George Duckweed, and Francis Bull. Also from New York were the Chromes, and the Beckisons, and the Dinnikers, and Russell Betty, and the Corrigans, and the Kelligers, and the Dewars, and the Scullys, and S.W. Belcher, and the Smirks, and the Young Quins, divorced now, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClearhan arrived always with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical, one with another, that it inevitably seemed that they had been there before. I have forgotten their names, Jacqueline, I think, or even Consuela, or Gloria, or Judy, or June, and their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and the months, or the sterner ones of the great American capitalists whose cousins of press they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all these, I can remember that Faustina O'Brien came there at least once, and the Baedeker girls, and young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Albexberger, and Miss Hagg, his fiancée, and Adrita Fitzpeters, and Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, and Miss Claudia Hipp, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something whom we called Duke, and whose name, if I ever knew it, I have forgotten. All these people came to Vernsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Vernsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties. Mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes from, suppose, the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream colour, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month, and found to my disappointment that he had little to say. So my first impression was that he was a person of some undefined consequence, had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Vernsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-coloured suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly, "what's your opinion of me, anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavoured conversation as his wholes. "I'll tell you God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. "I'm the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it, or choked on it as though it hadn't bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. "What part of the Middle West?" I inquired casually. "San Francisco." "I see. My family all died, and then I came to a good deal of money." His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. "After that I lived like a young Rajah in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago." With an effort I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbid character leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as the first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Forest I took 2 machine-gun detachments so far forward that there was half a mile gap on either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns, and when the infantry came up at the last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration, even Montegro, little Montegro down at the Adriatic Sea. Little Montegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with a smile. The smile comprehended Montegro's troubled history and sympathized with all the brave struggles of the Montegran people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribune from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached in his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. "That's the one from Montenegro." To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. "Poderi de Danilo," ran the circular legend, "Montenegro Nicholas Rex." "Turn it." "Major J. Vernsby," I read, "for valor extraordinary." Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers, loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. There was Vernsby, looking little not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in the palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson-lighted depths gnawing at his broken heart. "I'm going to make a big request of you today," he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. "So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me." He hesitated. "You'll hear about it this afternoon." "At lunch?" "No, this afternoon. I happen to find that you are taking Mrs. Baker to tea." "You mean you're in love with Miss Baker?" "No, old sport, I'm not. Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter." I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Vernsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gilt 1900s. Then the Valley of Ashes opened on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson straining at the grass pump with painting vitality as we went by. With fingers spread like wings, as we scattered through the half of Astoria, only half, for as we twisted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug-jug spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. "All right, old sport," called Vernsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. "Right you are," agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. "Know you next time, Mr. Vernsby." "Excuse me." "What was that?" I inquired. "A picture of Oxford?" I was able to do the commissioner a favour once, and he sends me Christmas cards every year. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising above the river in white heaps and sugar lumps all built with a wash of non-olfactory money, the city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its wild first promise of all the mystery and beauty of the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of Southern Eastern, and I was glad that the sight of Vernsby's splendid car was included in our somber holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur, in which sat 3 Nordish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Vernsby could happen without any particular wonder.